During elections, we have a unique opportunity to demand direct democracy. This is the best time for us to negotiate with candidates their commitment to legislate the policies we want. An important electoral issue is public education. And to help us understand how the educational service works, we're going to hear from representatives from several levels of education. They want you to know that the chronic underfunding of our governments has put public education in crisis.
My name is Linda Leone and I'm from Camosun College and I work in the Early Learning and Care program. So this is starting at the beginning. We now have ample evidence, probably about at least 40 years of hard research that tells us that what children experience in the first 5 years of life sets a critical foundation for the entire life course. We have many studies that tell us that early childhood experience strongly influences basic learning, school success, economic participation, social citizenry, and health. We also have a large body of research that shows that many challenges in adult society, such as eating disorders, heart disease, criminality, mental health, and competence in literacy and numeracy, have their roots in early childhood. Neuroscientists and now economists stand hand in hand with early childhood advocates for early learning and care programs. Neuroscientists have identified the first 5 years of life as the prime time for neural development, with 90% of the brain developed by the age of 2. We just keep adding on and losing those neurons after that. Economists tell us that based on the available evidence, an investment in early childhood is the most powerful investment a country can make, with returns many times over the amount of that original investment. Canadian governments, both provincial and national, could make policies and implement a child care system based on this very powerful body of research. But our governments haven't done that yet. Canada does not have a system of publicly funded early learning and care. Canada has weak public policies and limited funding for early learning. And this has resulted in divisions between learning and care. The overall costs of these programs are inconsistent. Those of you who are parents and have had any kind of interaction with childcare, you already know the parent fees are high, and those fees do not cover the costs of good learning and care. Childcare spaces are sometimes very hard to find, and we know there are not enough qualified people to work in them. Well, while BC may own the podium, for many Olympic sports, we come in last in how much developed nations spend on our youngest children. Our early learning and care programs have been called patchwork by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and this is a worldwide organization, the OECD. And the OECD recommends countries spend at least 1% of their gross national product on regulated child care because this supports economic growth. Well, Canada spends 0.25%, a quarter of the lowest recommended amount, on their children. This means that our early learning programs are predominantly market-based, they're ad hoc systems, and they're a provision of children's services that are sometimes in place or they're private arrangements. In fact, in BC, our early childhood educators of BC have presented this government here with ways to roll out a system for BC that is publicly funded that would probably take about 3 years to implement, and I can guarantee, I've seen the report, it won't cost us very much. We can have publicly funded systems of early learning and care that are affordable and accountable to taxpayers. These systems can be sensitive to families' traditions and first languages, and I know this for a fact. I've been teaching in early childhood as an educator of children and as an educator of adults for over 30 years, and we are ready. Our biggest barrier is lack of political will.
British Columbia has fallen in the level of funding in relation to other provinces. We're way behind provinces like Ontario and so on, and the combination of high levels of high proportions of children that live in poverty in British Columbia, which is very high across Canada. Despite the fact we have a rich province, we have many children who are not well served economically. And then when we underfund the public schools, which the government has been doing over the last 20 years or so, this exacerbates the problem.
Is underfunded, and the structure of our public school system is based on a very industrial revolution idea of education, that we take children in according to their age and we move them through boxes until they graduate as workers. Mm-hmm. This goes against everything we know about learning and child development and psychology. People do not progress in learning according to their age. They progress differently. So the public school system right now is bursting at the seams because it has all of these children with learning needs that aren't being addressed, because we assume if you're 6, you need to learn this. If you're 7, you need to learn this. I'd like to see that paradigm broken down. And then I think what we'll see is a lot more outcomes and people more willing to put money into the education system when we're seeing the outcomes that we want, which is well-educated, literate citizens ready to take their role in democracy.
You think people would be willing to pay more taxes in lieu of because of schooling?
I think that's one of the things that British Columbians want to see done well in our province. Right now, I don't see people willing to pay a whole lot of taxes for anything because we're not getting value from it. If we start seeing value for our money, then I think there's going to be people willing to say, yes, that's something I want to invest in. It's being done well. Here's my support for it.
If it's a specific, if my taxes are specific for something rather than from a roof of a stadium or a bridge or something like that, then you think people would be more willing to increase their taxes?
Yes, I think people would like to see what their money's being put towards. There has to be some accountability. When I pay school taxes, I want to know that that's actually going to support schools and not into general revenues.
We are below the average in the Canada now. Traditionally, we were, in the top 3 or so provinces, but we have fallen.
Now we're below 5. Because of the shortfall from the government in supporting public institutions, there have been a lot of fees implemented for some activities in the schools. Is that hindering the system?
It absolutely is. I have a son in kindergarten, and my school is very fortunate in that we have a very active PAC, but not all schools have parents with the same means to provide for extra programming. And every time you get an ask for a donation to your school or an extra fee for a program, a little bit of your heart breaks because it's something that you want to provide for your child so badly. And yet at home, you're just absolutely squeezed. You literally cannot come up with another $40 activity fee. And there are so many families out there right now that are just struggling to keep ends meet. And we just keep getting, fee after fee piled on. We're starting to break. It's not working anymore.
And puts families on a stress, eh?
Very, very stressful.
Especially low-income families, yeah. There is also apparently lack of instructors because they can't hire them. There is not enough budget for hiring. Yet there's a lot of unemployed teachers around, or underemployed teachers. Yeah. Is there something wrong with the government that doesn't want to fund for education?
You've just asked me if there's something wrong with the government that doesn't want to fund for education. Yes, there's something wrong with the government that doesn't want to fund education. But I don't want to attribute it to not wanting to fund. It's that they're simply not seeing the long-term impacts of underfunding education. When we don't fund education so that every child has an opportunity to get a good education, we see the results when they graduate and they become less employable, so they're earning less than they could have if they'd got a good education. That moves them forward into the position of raising a family, where they bring in less advantages to that family. It cascades through the generations. So if we don't fund education now, we're creating more problems for the future.
We see how this operates in two other Anglo-Saxon countries, the U.S. south of the border, where many of the people who are quite well-to-do choose to send their children to private education because they believe that the public educational system is not working very well, that it is, as you say, under-resourced, underfunded, and therefore they choose to opt out and put their kids in separate private arrangements. What this does is undermine their willingness also to pay taxes for the public system, because if they're paying for their kids to go to private school, they'll resent normally paying taxes to support the public system, which their children are not participating in. So you get this growing dynamic in which those who have moved their children out of the public system no longer want to support the public system. See that also across the pond in England, where you've had a long tradition of elite private education with Eton and Harrow, Oxford and Cambridge, where the aristocracy and subsequent those who are extremely well-to-do and the upper middle class in England make huge sacrifices to get their kids into private schools, both primary and secondary private schools, and subsequently as the education that they get there is seen as a ticket to getting into an elite university like Oxford or Cambridge. And that too is, in my view, inappropriate, and it is a vehicle through which an elite maintains its control over the broad society through the educational system that it controls. Again, I don't think in Canada, luckily, have not fully gone down that path. But with growing inequality in the country, that is a possibility that we now face.
Jordan Bateman, is that well pronounced?
Yes. Yep.
Jordan Bateman, you work with the BC Taxpayers Association.
I am the BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation.
Oh, the Canadian, but you also focus on the BC.
Yeah, I'm the BC Director.
Yeah. BC Director as well. And I see that in two camps. One is the academic side. Is it better academically? And the other one is economically. So let's focus first on academically. Why is it better private education academically?
Well, I think when we talk about public and private education, it's important to know that the best systems work hand in hand. I don't think public education would be as good today without a strong independent school sector. I don't think independent schools in BC would be as strong without a good public sector. I think they need both. And I'm not trying to dance a line here. I just really believe that the best systems offer that choice to parents. My kids are in the public system. Friends of mine have kids in the independent system. A lot of it just depends on the kid. It's so hard to give this kind of global, every child is so different. even within the same family, children are different. It's hard to give this kind of global, this is the best system for every child. I actually don't think you can do that. So the more options there are for families, I think the better.
Mm-hmm. So, but what would be one reason why people would prefer to have private education? Is there is an age on it that they prefer because there is a little better than the public education?
Yeah, I think independent schools, and it's important to note, independent schools have grown every year in enrollment in British Columbia for 40 years. I mean, there's no other business in BC that has seen that kind of steady growth year after year. They've never had a year where enrollment has shrunk. So clearly, parents want something. I hear from a lot of parents that they want schools that line up with their values. And, so some of these schools are obviously religious schools. They teach the BC curriculum, but at the same time, they provide that kind of value training. That's important to parents. Other parents want more involvement with their schools. So they want to rally around it. They want to be more involved, more plugged in with the classroom every day. They feel that independent schools offer that better ability to do that.
Do private schools complement or undermine public education?
I'd like to distinguish between different kinds of private schools. First of all, there's private schools, what you expect to hear. So in Victoria here, we have St. Michael's and Glenlyon, Norfolk, and we also have the Catholic schools, St. Andrews, and then we have private institutions that are set up because they have specific programs like the Montessori programs and the Elizabeth Buckley School. So they're all a variety of choices. But what I'd actually like to see is that programming becoming available in the public school system. Because right now, there's only one mode of education in our public school system here in Greater Victoria. And if that doesn't work for you, you have to go and pay for an education that does work for you. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for a lot of families.
So instead of integrating that new system or new methods into the public school by having it separate, it doesn't really help to develop within the public system, does it?
That's right. And if there's barriers to getting a different kind of education than what all of the sort of mainstream schools provide. Now, there are public schools which try to give different kinds of programming. So there are the academy programs, there are schools that have more parent participation, more arts programming, but the variety of choice isn't there in the public system, and I'd like to see that choice available to parents and families. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Some feel the quality is better in independent schools. They look at things like the Fraser Institute's studies on what schools are performing well, and they think that these schools are the best. And then finally, a lot of parents just want kind of that added discipline that comes with an independent school, often in the form of uniforms, rules, some of those values-based stuff. Because they have kids who would value or benefit from that kind of stricter, that sort of stricter mindset.
You mentioned the Fraser Institute's studies. Do you have in mind any specific studies that they have done to show that it's better?
Well, I mean, it's pretty standard for the Fraser Institute. They look at different provinces. They've started doing schools in Ontario, British Columbia, anywhere where there's standardized testing. And consistently, independent schools come out higher. Now, the public schools will say, well, the independent schools can pick and choose their kids. We have to take any kid who walks through the door. That provides different challenges. It's only rich kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not necessarily true. That's not really a blanket statement that sums up both private and public schools. But obviously, the Fraser Institute's numbers show independent schools generally perform better.
So it's the tests that the Fraser Institute has carried on in Ontario and in other provinces that make you believe that, in fact, they are somehow superior than the public institutions.
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far to say they're superior. They're different. I think there's a bigger difference between the two than you think. I think the most telling number for me about the success of independent schools is the fact that enrollment has never dropped. Enrollment in public schools exploded in the 90s, has crumbled since then, but consistently, despite demographic changes, every single year there are more kids in independent schools in British Columbia than there were the year before. For 40 years, that's longer than I've been alive.
Well, I think that the Fraser Institute tests look for very specific measures of academic success, which are more typically found in students that have come from a strong socioeconomic background. So they're coming from parents who probably have the money to pay for private schools, which means that they have probably good jobs and good educations to begin with. So on average, the population that they're sampling just comes from a completely different background. I'd like to see public school systems increase their achievement, but it's not just about what's on these standardized tests either. That's not necessarily a measure of success in learning.
Is there room within the public education for private education?
Well, we do have private education, and there may be people who need alternatives to the public system. But the main reason for a public system is to make sure that every child gets an opportunity for a good education and that we learn how to become citizens. So, education is both a private good for individuals and families, but it's also a public good, and preparing us to fulfill our roles as citizens.
Yeah. Well, now the private educators will say, but that's exactly what we do. We also teach kids how to be good citizens.
We've had private education for several thousand years, and private education was unable to provide education for everyone. It took the investment of public education. It took people committed to give every child access to education. So that's a great change. It's fairly recent, actually. Public education began in British Columbia in 1871. Yeah, so it's a fairly new development to make sure that everyone can get education provided through tax dollars. And this is not to say that private schooling can't do a good job, but public schooling can provide every child with the opportunity to learn and grow and develop.
So obviously, like, I'm a free enterprise kind of guy. If the customers are speaking with their feet, they're actually paying their taxes and then paying extra money on top to put their kids in these schools at growing numbers every year. Something is working in that system we should be looking at and wondering, is there lessons we can learn from the independent schools that maybe we should apply to the public schools?
All right. Now you mentioned business and you mentioned free enterprise. And what is the economic advantage of people having private schools rather than public schools?
Well, there's a definite advantage to taxpayers. When independent schools educate children, they educate them at a rate, at a cost of less money to the taxpayer. It's about 50% of the cost that a public school takes. And that's because, parents are making up more of that money with their own tuitions. So, if we closed every independent school tomorrow or suddenly absorbed them into the public system, the system would go broke. I mean, we just could not afford to educate those kids in a public school setting. So actually, there is a benefit to taxpayers by having these flourishing independent schools. It does save us money.
Who is us? You say
taxpayers.
It's the taxpayer. So you as a taxpayer, you don't pay school taxes?
No, every taxpayer pays school taxes, but what I'm saying is the way education funding works in BC is every student gets a certain amount of money from the provincial government that goes to the school district to fund the schools, pay the teachers, all that. It's roughly $9,000, give or take.
Per child?
Per student, yeah.
Okay.
Independent schools get only half of that. They get about $4,500 per student.
Okay.
So if we took a kid out of Pacific Academy Independent School in Surrey and put them into Lord Tweedsmuir in Surrey, a public school, we would have to make up as taxpayers $4,500 more out of the Victoria coffers in order to educate that student. So it is more expensive. Parents are paying their school taxes for independent schools and then also paying tuition on top of it and saving other taxpayers money.
Yeah. private education undermining or complementing public education. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah.
That's one.
You want me to start? Yes?
Yeah, just within a couple of minutes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, my view is that we need to strengthen the public education system, and that it should be for everyone. I have real concerns about the way in which private education has expanded over the last couple of decades in Canada, and the potential danger of having a very elite private educational system. Now, we have some of that already, and some of that goes back quite a number of years. You have Upper Canada College and Ridley and some of those other private schools where members of the elite send their children. But we've seen, in my view, an expansion of the number of private schools and the scope of their activities. And it seems to me that what this does down the road is lead to a kind of two-tiered educational system where people who are the children of those who are affluent and well-to-do and well-connected get a special arrangement, special channel into higher education particularly. And also the private schools act as a kind of a social network for the establishment of a future elite in Canada. They've always done that to some degree, but I think that's becoming more prominent. I would say also that with the great increase in inequality that we've seen in Canada over the last 30 years or so, we will see more pressure for private education because those who are newly affluent, very affluent, i.e. are multi-millionaires and billionaires, will want more opportunities for their kids to have special education and privileged education. And so there will be an ongoing tension and arguably struggle between those who believe that education is a universal right for everyone and should be offered equally, and those who believe that education should be a privilege for those who have money and can channel their children into the elite school system. One of the issues here that we really need to get our heads around as well is the extent to which private education is actually being subsidized by the taxpayers through the ability of various private educational institutions to claim charity status, and therefore for those who make donations to them to get tax credit for the money that they're providing. I think this is quite inappropriate. I think that the education system, as I said, should be publicly financed as public education, and that I don't think that public tax dollars should be going to subsidize elite private education, which in my view it currently is doing significantly.
And that's probably one of the problems of underfunding the public education. I understand it's been gradually being deeper and deeper and underfunded.
We see how this operates in two other Anglo-Saxon countries, the U.S. south of the border, where many of the people who are quite well-to-do choose to send their children to private education because they believe that the public educational system is not working very well, that it is, as you say, under-resourced, underfunded, and therefore they choose to opt out and put their kids in separate private arrangements. What this does is undermine their willingness also to pay taxes for the public system, because if they're paying for their kids to go to private school, they'll resent normally paying taxes to support the public system, which their children are not participating in. So you get this growing dynamic in which those who have moved their children out of the public system no longer want to support the public system.